Hey everyone, and welcome back to today's Explainer. We are diving into a really fascinating and honestly a deeply empathetic corner of educational psychology today. We're going to be unpacking a historical, clinical concept that completely shaped how we teach and support students. Now, the source material we're looking at uses the older clinical term, the backward child. Today, in modern educational circles, you'd recognize this as the slow learner. And we're going to break down exactly what that actually means, both clinically and practically, right now.
I want you to just picture this for a second. Imagine a student's day-to-day reality in the classroom. You're sitting at your desk, and the teacher's instructions, they sound almost like a foreign language. The clock is literally ticking, all your friends are scribbling down answers, and you are just hopelessly stuck on step one. It's this daily, relentless struggle to keep pace. And understanding that reality, that's exactly why this topic is so absolutely crucial. If we really want to understand education, we have to understand the students who find themselves constantly falling behind.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're covering 1. Defining the slow learner, 2. Traits of educational deficiency, 3. The root causes, 4. Methods of identification, and finally, 5. The emotional toll.
Let's jump right into part 1, defining the slow learner and getting our clinical baseline.
Okay, to understand what this means, we really need to put our objective hats on. Clinically speaking, a slow learner is not just a kid who, forgot to do their homework. We are talking about a child whose educational attainment is actually falling below the level of their own natural abilities. It's a marked educational deficiency when you put them side by side with peers of the exact same age. Basically, it's a huge disconnect between the progress we'd normally expect from them and the actual results they are getting in the classroom.
And there's this quote from Bert that just hits the nail on the head for what this looks like in practice. He describes the slow learner as a child who is unable to cope with the work normally expected of his age group. That daily struggle to just cope with standard expectations is massive. And because they're constantly lagging behind, these kids frequently face a really tough, highly visible consequence. They end up having to repeat a grade. They're stuck doing the same class over again while they watch all their friends move on.
To put some hard numbers to this, the intelligence quotient, or IQ, of slow learners generally sits right between 70 and 90. And because of that specific range, dealing with abstract materials, think complex math formulas or really advanced reading comprehension, it becomes a huge, sometimes completely insurmountable hurdle. Their reasoning ability just doesn't quite match up with normal progressing kids, and their attention span tends to be a bit shorter. So the traditional classroom, which is absolutely packed with abstract reasoning, just becomes this constant uphill battle.
Now here's where it gets kind of interesting. This educational deficiency doesn't always look the exact same across the board. The source points out two totally distinct types. First, you have general backwardness, which is exactly what it sounds like. The child is struggling in all their subjects. But then there's specific backwardness. This is when a child lags behind in just one or two specific areas. So you might have a student who is an incredible reader but shows severe deficiency in math, or vice versa. It's a surprisingly nuanced spectrum.
Moving right along to Section 2, Traits of Educational Deficiency. Basically, what does this actually look like?
We've got the definitions down, but let's talk about what teachers actually see. And it's not just about test scores, right? Physically, compared to their peers, backward children might show inferior physical development. Things like poor muscular coordination, slower reaction times, or even issues with their eyes, ears, or speech. Mentally, we see that lower IQ we just talked about, a shorter attention span, and that struggle with critical thinking. And then, really sadly, socially and morally, these students often end up rejected and isolated by their classmates. So when you combine all these physical, mental, and social factors, it severely limits a child's ability to just direct their own learning.
Which brings us to Section 3, the root causes, looking beyond the classroom.
So seeing all those traits naturally makes you wonder, why is this happening in the first place? Well, the big takeaway here is that an educational deficiency is almost never just an intellectual issue. No way. It is this huge intertwined web of biology and environment. The root causes span physical and physiological factors, intellectual limits, the family dynamic at home, the actual school environment itself, and even broader social factors. It's a massive puzzle that extends way outside the four walls of the school.
Okay, on to Section 4, Methods of Identification, or as I like to think of it, the detective work.
Because those causes are so wildly varied, it brings up a really tough question. With all those physical, mental, and social signs mixed together, how do professionals actually cut through the noise? How do they make sure they aren't just misdiagnosing a kid who's maybe a bit unmotivated versus a child who genuinely fits the clinical definition of a slow learner?
While they rely on a pretty robust toolkit, it's a 6-step process, really. Step 1 is using achievement and diagnostic tests to pinpoint the exact nature of the struggle. Step 2 brings in those standardized intelligence tests for an intellectual baseline. Step 3 goes even deeper with psychological tests to gauge things like mental health, creativity, and motivation. Step 4 is situational observation, literally just watching how the student behaves in real time. Step 5 is a full medical examination to catch any physical hurdles. And finally, Step 6 pulls in student records and past history. When you combine all 6 of those pieces, you get a much more accurate, holistic profile of what the child can actually do.
And now, Section 5, the emotional toll, the hidden cost.
I want to slow down our pacing for just a second here, because this is honestly the most heartbreaking part of today's explainer. We've talked about the clinical stuff, the IQs, the diagnostic tools, but we have to talk about the internal reality for these kids. When learning doesn't feel meaningful, motivation just dies. But it's worse than that. Because of these repeated daily defeats in the classroom, the child literally stops believing they are capable of learning at all. The source material describes them as becoming failure-oriented. They develop this deep, paralyzing fear of failure that just completely strips away any confidence to try new things.
There's this line from the text that is just incredibly powerful, and it captures this intense psychological battle perfectly. It says, "He is flooded with anxiety produced by the defenses he has created against self-devaluation." Really think about that for a second. To protect their own self-worth from this constant feeling of academic failure, these kids build up heavy psychological armor. But those very defenses end up keeping them in a constant, overwhelming state of anxiety.
And you can probably guess where all that anxiety and isolation leads, right? The clinical struggles, the daily academic defeats, the feeling rejected by peers, it all eventually boils over into deep-seated resentment. The text notes that these students often become bitter and intensely hostile towards school and even towards society as a whole. And it is entirely driven by the sheer accumulated humiliation they've had to endure, day in and day out.
Which leaves us with this final, absolutely vital question. If a child has been clinically defined by what they can't do, isolated by their traits, and battered by a system that leaves them completely flooded with anxiety and hostility, how can we effectively reintegrate a failure-oriented child into an educational society they have grown to feel intensely hostile toward? It is a massive, incredibly complex challenge for educators and psychologists, and it's something I really want you to chew on today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, you guys. Keep asking those big questions, and I will see you next time.